Hey there. So in my first video, I talked about how I came to the conclusion that if this life is a test administered by a grand creator, that the best way to navigate that test would be to use rational thought, which is the thing that Adam failed to do. And then in the second video, I kind of talked about my own experience in regards to my initial chink in the armor of faith, where it occurred to me that the organization wasn't actually presenting me with the unvarnished truth. And it was probably anticlimactic for a lot of people about that video, because it wasn't like some immoral behavior that I witnessed or hypocrisy or anything other than bearing false witness coming from the headquarters. But it was just a factual, obvious demonstration of the authors of the organization's literature intentionally mishandling and misleading their audience by taking a quote from another author and deliberately removing all the context for that quote and trying to paint his thoughts in a different light than how he presented them in the initial source material. And then after I noticed that, there were example after example in that same book, the creation book, that caused me to recognize that I couldn't simply take as gospel the literature anymore. That they were willing to deceive their audience the same way all other, I shouldn't say that. There are plenty of organizations that try to be as honest and forthright as possible. But the point is, this one wasn't superior in any moral sense to other organizations that are presenting their views. So that wasn't the end of it. I didn't throw out what at the time I thought was the baby in the bathwater at that point. I continued for years to try to fit a square peg of the actual tangible material world that I could see with my own eyes into the round hole that was being presented more as a mental picture from the organization. So I didn't immediately change my behavior or do anything, really. Not that I had much choice. I was already baptized by that point and living under my parents' roof, so I wasn't going to lash out and become some a moral monster or anything. I kind of just clung to it and kept trying to make it work because I thought there must be something all these other people know that I don't know. There's so many old people, intelligent people, wise people that have gone through so many life experiences. There must be something that they're seeing that I am not. Otherwise, how could they have not picked up on these things the same way I have? But one thing that experience did teach me was not to tell anybody about my questions or thoughts, because they wouldn't be addressed as genuine questions or thoughts. They would be treated as moral shortcomings. To doubt the credibility of the organization, it was tantamount to doubting Jehovah, which was obviously a sin in their mind. So, a couple of years later, I actually studied the creation book with my dad. And all I did was recite back to him all the answers that were contained in the material, and didn't once attempt to push back on any of the ideas that I knew were deceptive contained in that book. Because I couldn't bring myself to position myself in the place of a resistor or immoral, mentally diseased kid who just couldn't get it, couldn't understand where they were coming from. So, it wasn't like I suddenly started misbehaving or anything, or even had the desire to do anything that would be considered unchristian at that point in my life. I continued behaving as if I was a representative of God's only earthly organization, and still didn't date or celebrate any holidays, and I really didn't mind any of that stuff, because the opportunity to sacrifice and be persecuted on behalf of the Creator is something you kind of look forward to, just in case there was somebody out there watching out and storing up treasures for me elsewhere. I think one of the reasons I don't have as much bitterness or resentment probably has a lot to do with it. My childhood was pretty decent. Yes, I didn't celebrate holidays or whatever, but at least it was a stable, loving family with 2 parents, and I can't really complain all that much up until the point where I was disfellowshipped. That's a different story. But the other thing is, I didn't really waste a second of my adult life feeling like I was misled, or like I wasted any time, because I couldn't have done otherwise, even being under my parents' roof, and as soon as I was out, I was out. So maybe that's why in that second video I started off by saying something about the whole, how I think it's a bad approach to antagonize the people at the carts, but maybe I just can't empathize enough to relate to how what that means to the people that are doing it. So, because I really don't have any remaining bitterness left towards the organization. But despite the fact that I continued trying to believe and trying to make it work for a couple of years, in the back of my mind I was harboring all of these facts and evidentiary discoveries that I had come across during that period of my life. So 3 or 4 years worth of stuff that I couldn't discuss with anybody else, including my own friends and family, for fear of being outed as a slanderer or resistor or something. And I think I want to just go through some of that stuff and vent, because I didn't really get a chance to talk about it to anybody at the time. The first thing that really, well, I guess the first thing is what I mentioned in the last video, which was the recognition of the fact that there are no life forms or anything on planet Earth that indicate that the world was lovingly created for the benefit of humankind. You can't plant a sequoia seed that grows into a nice biodegradable shelter for humans. You can't go pick up a shell on the shore that has cell signal, or wheels and axles organically created with the muscles of horses or something that you can ride around in. There is nothing out there that simply exists for the benefit of humankind that isn't some sort of symbiotic trade-off between organisms. But there are all kinds of organisms that'll try to kill you and each other, and are apparently well designed to do so. Not to mention an entire ecosystem that has gone extinct based on violence and devastation that the witnesses never seem to, don't really have dialed in what their opinion is of dinosaurs. But that's the sort of thing that you can't just ignore. You can't just say, I don't know the answer, but I am certain that I have the truth. If there are things that big, you need to have some sort of explanation. And you can't just put your head in the sand and pretend that the universe is not what it is. So one of the first things I noticed was the immense amount of time that that the universe has been around. And it's hard to square that with the idea that there's only, been like 5,000 years of divine guidance. When you can look with your own two eyes at a galaxy that is 13 billion light years away. So if you look through a telescope, it is possible to see with your own two eyes a galaxy that is located 13 billion light years away from Earth. And that has real world implications. First of all, if you're able to see it, that means the light has traveled all the way to the lens of your telescope. And we know the speed that light travels. And we know that it would have had to have traveled for 13 billion years in order to reach you, which means that that galaxy has been there for at least 13 billion years. Now, that's a lot of time. There's a whole lot of time for stuff to exist. For only a few thousand years ago, any divine intervention to take place. And then all of a sudden, the kinds of divine intervention that did take place were like, one of my first talks was about the story of Elijah and how God was very helpful back in those days for providing evidence for his existence, because he allowed himself to be tested against Baal. And he torched some sacrifice, even though it was doused in water, and just bent over backwards to provide this evidence of his existence. Incidentally, slaughtered everybody who doubted his existence after the fact. But the point is, he showed up big time. But the Old Testament is littered with stories like that, of the kinds of intervention that took place where he would instruct people to rape and pillage and keep the virgins for yourself and kill the babies, and just all sorts of things that are very obviously humans and not some guy who created everything 14 billion years ago. And only now the best ideas he has are, if a woman intervenes in a fight and accidentally and grabs somebody by the balls, that she needs to have her hand cut off. Like, this is the kind of issue the creator of the universe that was around for at least 14 billion years, that you can witness that with your own eyes. And some of the advice he gives is, make sure you cut off somebody's hand and don't show any mercy if she grabs a guy by the balls. It's very strange worldviews that can't really be integrated very easily. But in addition to that, in addition to the immense amount of time that the universe has been around, there's the immense amount of locations for events to have unfolded, such as life and cutting off hands and all of that. Because, and if you don't know this, you might not know this if you're only starting to branch out and consider other ideas, but this is a fact. And if you do know it, I'm sorry if I'm boring you, but one fact that I could never get over was the amazing revelation that all of the stars are suns serving other planets. Within the last 10 or 20 years, I mean, this has been a hypothesis for a long time, but now we know for a fact that pretty much every star you look at has planets. And our star is just an ordinary star, what we call the sun. The reason the sun looks so big compared to other stars is that the other suns are very far away, but our sun is average size, so some of those are bigger than ours, smaller, whatever. But more importantly, they all have planets. So Earth has 8 or 9 planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Earth, Jupiter, We have a few. But let's say on average, each one of those distant suns has about 3 planets on average. Well, how many planets would that be? There are somewhere around 1 trillion suns in our universe, which means there would be around 3 or 4 billion trillion planets in our universe, and they've all been floating around for somewhere around 13 billion years. Not all the planets, but planets come and go. Earth, according to scientists, is about 4 billion years old. How does that work in conjunction with Genesis? That it was all created for us. And more importantly, why did it take 3 days to create the earth? And we're thinking of these in time frames that are, if you take witness ideology, like maybe 10,000 years per day or something. Even if they're just general increments of time. How on earth does it take 3 of those increments of time to make this one tiny planet? And then on the 4th day, you create all of the other 3 billion trillion planets in our universe. And more importantly, why not mention that they're distant suns? Do you know how far that would go in ensuring that many, many people believe this as the literal message from a divinely inspired creator? Instead, it just says they're points of light to help you identify seasons and to navigate. Why not say these are distant suns, each with their own planet? Why not mention all kinds of things that we now know, that all of life is run on a specific code and it's all the same alphabet, just variations of it? You know how inspiring that would be to have a book written so long ago that had that kind of information in it? How hard it would be to doubt the credibility of a book like that? And you say, well, that would interfere with free will if it was undeniable, right? Not so much. Did the angels have free will? They saw the whole thing. Did it interfere with free will when Elijah tested God? And not only tested him, but mocked his opponent's God by saying he was taking a dump. Did it interfere with free will that the Israelites saw the Red Sea open? Did it interfere that despite having seen resurrections and all the miracles and walking on water, Thomas still got a chance for an additional confirmation to put his finger in the wounds of a resurrected Christ? Is it really that much to ask for that there would be some indication in the modern world that the authors of the Bible knew what they were talking about? At least. Not asking for a miracle, just some wisdom that couldn't have been introduced by a goat herder 5,000 years ago. But there is nothing of the sort. And what we do know tends to contradict the things that you can visually actually see and experience of the world, tend to contradict the messages contained therein. And Jesus said that the last days would be like the days of Noah's flood. Well, from where I'm sitting, that's kind of a comforting message, because that means there's not really going to be much of anything happening. Maybe a local disaster. But how do I know that? Well, there's a million things to call into question about the idea that the entire planet was destroyed by water 4,500 years ago. But one that really ought to stick out to you is the continent of Australia, because that one kills two birds with one stone. The thing about Australia is everything that's alive, every mammal on Australia has a pouch. Everything is a marsupial that's native to that island continent. The scientific explanation for that is that before placental mammals came along, there were pouched mammals. And around the time that we were in the pouched phase for hairy mammals, the continent of Australia was breaking off. Which means that everything on Australia descended from a common ancestor that had a pouch, which is a great explanation for why koalas and kangaroos and marsupial wolves and marsupial mouse all have pouches, and they're all more genetically related to each other, using the same tools you would use to test, to see if, to convict somebody in court, because the evidence is that solid. That everything on that island is related to everything else that's a warm-blooded mammal. And this doesn't count birds or reptiles, but all the native mammals are related because they share a common ancestor, and how could they not? It's an island. Contrast that with the flood narrative, where all those things that happen to be related to each other and have pouches banded together and swam or otherwise were magically transported to that island with no evidence of that event having had occurred. You can see Australia with your own eyes. You can observe that everything has a pouch. Either it is there to deceive you into thinking there was no flood and that there may just be something to the narrative that life evolves from common ancestors. Or you can say that is actually what happened. It's not, that God isn't tricking you. What is the better explanation? So, just a few really big holy crap facts. The continent of Australia. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to compare these two ideas. And growing up as a witness, you don't really understand the idea of natural selection or evolution at all. You think it means that chaos and random events caused all of this well-designed world and life forms to come into existence. But so you might reason to yourself, I don't believe that there's any way humans, for one common argument I remember hearing growing up, including from my own family, was if humans came from monkeys, why are monkeys still here? That is, first of all, humans didn't come from monkeys. But even if they did, that's a lot like saying, if chihuahuas came from wolves, how are wolves still here? But it's really more like saying, if chihuahuas came from wolves, how are St. Bernards still here? Because no one's saying we came from monkeys, we're saying we share a common ancestor. Or I think an analogy I really like is language. Because technically, that really is what it is a life code, a language. And you are in the middle of evolving a language right now. And you may not notice it. And your kids will speak the same language you teach them growing up. But it is not hard to see that over some time, Spanish, French, German, English, all descended from Latin. And at no point in that chain did a kid grow up speaking a completely different language than its parents. So at no point in the Chihuahua's formation did a wolf give birth to a Chihuahua. It didn't suddenly happen. It's just an accumulation of changes. And it works the same way in language, and it works the same way in biology. I'll believe a penguin is a bird when I see a seagull give birth to a penguin. Well, that is not an argument. That is just a failure of your imagination to realize that changes can accumulate over time. And if you look back through written language in the 16th century, thou comest thee hither, and you compare local dialects between Boston and LA, you can see divergence, small divergence in real time. But you can track it looking back at written language. And you can see how these changes occurred. And the same is true with the natural world. You can see divergence in the fossil record. You can track it in the genetic code. Another example of that, another fact that you just gotta contend with, if you disagree with this idea, is all of the animals that contain genes that do things that their ancestors needed that are now obsolete. So, for example, chickens. It's very easy to induce a chicken to grow reptilian teeth because chickens are descendants of reptiles. The thing is, chickens contain the genes of those reptiles with a few flaws, a few errors, so that they no longer produce teeth and they have beaks that are better for their behavior and survival. But if a chicken or a bird was just straight up created, why does it contain the genes from its reptilian ancestors? And this is where it gets really, really fuzzy. Humans have certain genes that are shut off, that are imperfectly replicated, that turn out to be really advantageous to not have. So, for example, most animals, most primates have a giant muscle that extends from the back of their skull all the way down to the bottom of their jaw. And it gives them immense strength when they go to bite. They can crush and destroy things with their mouths, much more so than the bite pressure of a human bite. The problem is having a muscle extend from the back of your skull to down to your jaw really cuts into the space you have for your cranial cavity. It reduces the amount of room there is for your brain. Humans have that gene. We have that ability to make that huge muscle with just a few copying errors that render it useless. But losing that muscle resulted in a lot of room for more brain, for more gray matter. And the one thing that sets us apart from everybody else, everything else on this earth, is our ability to reason with our prefrontal cortex and just draw connections and come to conclusions. And the fact that that is the result of an imperfect translation of a genetic code that we got from an ancestor makes you stop and think, at what point were human beings perfect? Because if the whole point of God having to sacrifice his son to restore perfection to humanity is to redeem the perfect man who sinned, how could we be the product of imperfect copies with messed up genes, and some of our best characteristics are the result of this imperfection? Our best characteristics are human mind. This is not up for debate. This is something you can observe with your own eyes. That in some cases microcephaly can result from the sequence of genes being activated. Anyway, once you get a hold of just a few of those big picture major things that you cannot deny, that you can see a galaxy that is that far away, that there is so much time you have to work with and many other planets you have to work with, and that looking in your own DNA and your own fossil record and that of every other species on Earth, that it's all designed to kill or avoid being killed, and there's no magic message contained within that DNA other than imperfect copies and duplicates and replication, and that it can be witnessed with your own eyes. There is no excuse to pretend you don't see what is all around you. So for those that are making videos that are just like really debating the nitty-gritty of, you know, whether the Trinity is true, whether Jesus is God, and all of that, before you get into all of those details, just stop and compare the compatibility of the biblical narrative with the actual, tangible, physical world around you. Maybe it's not as clear as it seems. Maybe the reason there's so much confusion about whether Christ is God or not is because the authors weren't very clear. Because it is it depends on which scriptures you choose to focus on and emphasize. Whether you decide that not consuming blood was just good advice at the time, because nobody knew about germs at the time, and that it shouldn't be taken so seriously that now you reject life-saving medical care, as if that was the real intention, when in nature, simply being born, you're very likely to consume your mother's blood when you're breastfeeding. Almost everybody survived that way. And if she has rusty pipe syndrome, you consumed a lot of it. When ticks and mosquitos and all sorts of insects violate that law, was the purpose of that law really to prevent you from dying? Or was it because people who drank blood or ate uncooked food turned up sick and sometimes died? It was good advice at the time. Do you really need to reject life-saving medication as a result? Or if you're going to go way overboard with that scripture, why water down other scriptures in the New Testament? Like, don't suffer a woman to teach in church. Women should be silent. Women should be silent. That's what it says. Why not take that way overboard? Why are women allowed to speak in church if not eating blood translates into not saving your life by injecting it intravenously? Why water down the idea that women need to be silent in church? I'll tell you why. It's some guy's opinion. I'm not saying women should be silent, by the way. I'm just saying I don't agree with either interpretation of either of those verses. But it's just some guy, or some group of men, saying this one needs to be taken super seriously and this one not so much. What concrete evidence do you have for the idea that you are being tested? There's also no supernatural wisdom found in any of the other books, the Quran and the Rig Veda. And if there really were some evil force controlling the rest of the world, how easy would it be for a demon to write a book that really deceives you into thinking that there is supernatural wisdom in there. If a demon knew half as much as we currently know about how the world works, why not include some of that information in the Quran? Why doesn't the Quran say that the stars are distant suns? Or that electricity can be generated by, static or friction or whatever? Instead, all of the books that contradict each other, that people die for, are the result of just ordinary people who didn't seem to know anything special. They thought the stars were points of light. They thought the sky was a dome. They thought the earth could be viewed by climbing a really tall mountain because it was flat. Incidentally, you're probably thinking, no. In Isaiah it says the earth is a circle, and then the word chug means sphere. Well, look up where the word chug is used in the rest of the Bible. Because in all the other locations, it's translated into horizon. There is no divine, supernatural brilliance emanating from Scripture. So before you spend a whole lot of time delving into the details of what each prophecy and everything else means, whose version, whether it's the Lutherans or the Mormons or whatever, before you can even get to the point where you're debating the contents of the Scripture, see how well the Scripture itself maps onto how the world actually works. So I will leave it there. Thank you, guys.